What I wanted to do this afternoon was to discuss the evolution of the Provisional Republican movement over the last 10, 15 years or so, but also to try to place that in the context of some other wider questions, and in particular to try to see how significant the relationship that the Provisionals had with the British state was in their development. So, although that's only one focus that's dealt with in the book, I think it actually is a central one, and I think should be very important in your discussions. But I also want to look at some other aspects of the organisational form and the ideological development of the Provisionals, separately from that of the British state, and in particular to try to place the Provisionals in the changing balance of forces internationally, to look at the impact, for example, that the changing geopolitical situation and the collapse of a number of national liberation movements, the development of peace processes in other parts of the world has had on the provisional movement. The Provisionals themselves, when they were considering, or provisional leadership, when they were considering their strategy, were obviously very well aware of this, and certainly in their internal discussions from the late 1980s onwards, there is evidence of this awareness of a changing climate and the impact that this could have on them. But also want to touch on the importance of the idea of peace processes and the methodology of peace processes, and the idea that the events in the north of Ireland have established a type of international ideology, as Jonathan Powell, one of Tony Blair's advisors, has put it recently in one of his books. This is the idea that former insurgents and former challenges to the established order can be brought into the political mainstream through a form of model of historical compromise, and that through an engagement with extremists and those who are previously considered to be beyond the pale can be brought into mainstream politics. And certainly that type of model has been floated in Iraq and Afghanistan, and indeed in the case of Martin McGuinness, one of the participants in the Irish model, has actually worked on the Iraqi model. So certainly the ruling class have attempted to draw lessons from events in the north. But I think there are perhaps two other wider questions which I will only touch on, and I think in a sense is the subtext of my contribution and of the discussion. And this is really the future of Irish republicanism, and whether republicanism as we've known it in the modern period, from the middle of the 19th century, certainly from the end of the 18th century, indeed has a future in Ireland. Indeed, whether we've come to the end of a defined historical period in Ireland, and that the national revolution, the task of establishing national democracy in Ireland and the reunification of Ireland, whether those are still viable, and indeed whether those are still possible tasks. In particular, the discussion about the nature of the southern state, and I noticed in a recent copy of the weekly work of the correspondence between Jack Conrad and Brian Keenan, and there was a fairly small point there, I think probably developed in more depth on the Internet Archive, which I've not yet had a chance to look at. But Jack Conrad and Brian Keenan are debating whether the southern state is in a sense a type of colony, and its relationship to developed capitalism. And I think Keenan eventually agrees with the argument that the southern state is a poorer form of a richer state. And it's very clear that the Celtic Tiger, although now running out of steam, and the nature of the southern economy has consolidated that state considerably. So where does Irish republicanism fit in with that? What would be the future functions of Irish republicanism? Does it mean, for example, that the defeat of the Provost has really meant the defeat or the ending of that type of function? In particular, as I will go on to develop, certain of the economic and social changes in the north might well pose that, particularly the concessions given to the Catholic middle class and the relative stabilisation. In in the book, I use as a concluding section two quotations, one from Karl Radak and one from Leon Trotsky, both around the time of the 1916 Rising. And Radak entitles his "The End of a Song," and in a way he echoes Trotsky's argument, or I'm not sure if the dates, whether Radak was echoing Trotsky or whether Trotsky was echoing Radak, but they both seem to suggest that the dealing with the land question, which was finally resolved apparently in 1903 with the Wyndham Act, that in a sense removes the material basis for the national revolution in Ireland. And Radak in particular says that the old national struggle is gone, and that the new banner will be taken up by the young Irish proletariat. And obviously developments didn't entirely work in that way. So I included that in a way as a sort of corrective to those people who, in a sense, say that the relative stabilisation in the north means the end of history. But I also included it to suggest that we shouldn't always be entirely too deterministic about the relationship between economic and political developments. But certainly that's something that I'm exploring, and I certainly would welcome comments, on that in the discussion. The other issue for me really is about the north itself. How stable is this entity? How stable is devolved government in the north of Ireland? It seems, although this doesn't receive a great deal of coverage in Britain itself, it seems to be almost in a phase of permanent crisis. But are those real crises, or are they simply shadow boxing, playing to the respective communal galleries? It seems fairly likely that policing and justice will be devolved to that government in the autumn, and that in a sense will mark the final shift of the provisionals into complete acceptance of the state and the status quo. So does this mean then that the north is now a relatively stable although tense entity, or are there still very severe structural fault lines? Well, obviously there are a whole series of unresolved questions. The fundamental national conflict is not removed, but even the communal conflict within inside the north itself is in fact strengthened and deepened by the Good Friday Agreement. A lot of the recent sociological analysis suggests that Northern Ireland is more deeply segregated and communalised than before, and commentators are apt to throw various statistics around, but just a few, that most people in public housing live in areas in which there are over 90% of their own co-religionists. In other words, the type of social mixing that many people argue would flow from the peace settlement has failed to take place. Likewise, the peace lines and the segregated areas, particularly in Belfast, have actually increased. And indeed, in some parts of the city, residents agitate to have new peace walls as evidence of these divisions. So, does the Good Friday Agreement represent essentially, in the words of Paul Bew in his recent history of Ireland, the management of enmity rather than its resolution? Well, quite obviously it does. But is this management of a fairly long-term and permanent character? Communal division is structured into the political institutions in the north. Politics are largely about communal bargaining for resources, in which the parties representing the different communal groupings argue that their community deserves resources, and often debates on anything from the 11 plus through to leisure facilities are pitched in these communal terms. Likewise, particularly in the nationalist community, and particularly amongst the provisionals, but also to a certain extent amongst unionists, politics have become not only a bargaining issue for resources, but also around cultural issues and identity issues, and in which symbolic issues become much more important than any real set of issues. So the north, I think, appears to be stable, but the structural conflicts haven't been resolved. Obviously, the national question still is there. And even though in many ways the Good Friday Agreement, with its emphasis on movement and transition, certainly in the way that the provisionals have pitched it, would seem to raise the possibilities that at some point, with consent, reunification could occur. In practice, the unionist veto is still in place, and in practice, the only type of settlement that is on offer in terms of the British state is essentially a form of Sunningdale. Again, to paraphrase, you can have any settlement you like, providing it's Sunningdale. That's the essential parameters. Now, if that structure leads to a type of stable instability, there are also, I think, some very significant social and economic factors. What direct rule has done, and I will, develop this point a little further when I look specifically at the provisionals. What direct rule has done has, in many ways, to shift resources towards sections of the nationalist population, and it has, in particular, seen, I think, the emergence, both through the direct intervention of direct rule from Westminster, but also through other social developments. It's seen very much the strengthening of the Catholic middle class, and that the real winners of the struggle are those Catholics who now live up on the Malone Road or in the various nice houses on the way out of Derry in towards Donegal. This emerging Catholic middle class group is much parodied, and indeed is much commented upon both by the unionists, who look rather sniffily down their nose at the numbers of Seamuses and Faneulas who are now joining the golf clubs and who are appearing on the television as members of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors or as barristers and so forth. But it's significant that this group now is, in a sense, has certainly benefited from the struggle, has gained, I think, a considerable number of political concessions, has a degree of political and social power, and in many senses, has arrived, has made it. So that, I think, is very much a stabilising factor. But there are also, I think, some destabilising factors, and in particular, the paradoxical role of the state under direct rule. The fact that its social and economic weight in Northern Ireland is so preponderant, as I will develop, that means that the question of the state and the level of state expenditure is in fact a very real issue in Northern Irish politics. And there are two, I think, quite conflicting tendencies there. The British government is attempting to restrict its levels of spending and is carrying out a series of reviews both of local government and of the devolved government in order to reduce spending, increasing levels of privatisation, increasing attempts to shift the burden of expenditure onto the working class and middle class populations. That, I think, is taking place at the time in which we're starting to see the general economic turbulence, and I think could lead to some destabilisation. In other words, that the state was willing, indeed felt obliged, needed to sink resources into the north of Ireland when it was facing an armed campaign, was in a position to support the peace process with continuing high levels of expenditure. But whether that is still a possibility, I think, is open to question. Now, whether that then means that we start to see the emergence of different types of politics, the debates around the water rates and the water taxation, whether we start to see the emergence of class politics, again, I think is an open is an open question. But it certainly means that economically and socially, the stability, which has been, I think, supported by British government expenditure, I don't think can continue indefinitely. And I think these economic and social factors, combined with the still existing communal structure and indeed the unresolved national questions, leaves a degree of instability. So although Northern Ireland may have disappeared off of the television screens, apart from the odd contentious march, there are still, I think, tendencies towards instability there. We mustn't just assume that, in a sense, it's gone to sleep in that way. Now, having in a sense done something of a sketch, and maybe asked a few questions, I want to try now to look particularly at the relationship between the Provisionals and the British state, and to try and trace the development of the Provisionals, and particularly their evolution from a mass insurrectionary movement in towards a mainstream governing party in the north of Ireland. Now, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the history of the Provisionals, and in a sense, I don't really need to, I think, go over it. But I think there are a couple of key points to refresh ourselves, and maybe to suggest that some of the readings of what has happened to the Provisionals lie within their own history, and are not, in a sense, recent developments, or indeed developments which come out of the blue. The Provisionals were, in their formative period, in their founding moment between the summer, autumn of 1969 and 1972, which is in many ways their high point, were a mass movement of the nationalist working class and the rural poor. And this founding moment, I think, is quite crucial. The Provisionals were very much a series of broad currents. They involved quite wide currents, particularly of the nationalist youth. They were often quite inchoate, they were often very eclectic in their politics, and many of the characterizations of the Provisionals, particularly at the time on the left, as Catholic nationalists or Catholic reactionaries, were often quite wide of the mark. The key point was that they reflected quite a cross-section and quite a spectrum of opinion in the nationalist population. And that meant that all sorts of currents could function within them, and indeed did. Now, it was very common, and indeed the British Army and others characterised the Provisionals in terms of traditional republicanism. And that ideology of traditional republicanism is, I think, in many ways a very elusive and indeed a very difficult concept to grasp, which in some senses makes a revisionist project, should you wish to undertake one, relatively easy, because the provisional movement, as indeed has been the case for Irish republicanism in much of the 20th century, rather like the Labour Party's socialism, provisional republicanism is what the leadership says it is. It is essentially, has one fairly clear aim, the removal of British rule from Ireland, or the reunification of the state after partition. But the nature of that republic, and indeed the type of compromises and the type of means of achieving that republic, are often open to a considerable amount of debate. It means, for example, that within the spectrum of republicanism, you can have people who are quite clearly Marxists, and I don't use that in the very light sort of popular sense, through to Catholic reactionaries, and I don't use that in the quite light popular sense either. Indeed, at Easter this year in County Fermanagh, I did have the living embodiment of that in a Republican Sinn Fein commemoration, in that Tommy McKinney, who was former member of the League of Communist Republicans and would still consider himself a Marxist, was in the same room as someone who I know from previous conversation was in fact, someone going on about Jews and Freemasons and the international Zionist conspiracy. And they both attended the same commemoration. I'm not sure Tommy would have been happy if he'd known. Now, that is just, I think, a very small illustration of the problem, the definition of Irish republicanism. Like all nationalist movements, it, I think, contains elements of both universal conceptions, universal politics, the type of class and national liberation politics that we would support. It in a sense, grounds itself in the Enlightenment, and indeed many provisionals quite consciously argue that they derive their politics from the traditions of the French Revolution. So that type of politics would represent the most progressive strand of Irish republicanism, would draw inspiration from all of the leading Republican thinkers that we would be familiar with. But republicanism also contains within itself nationalist elements which are essentialist, which are particularist, which often take the form of ethnic nationalism, often identify with a model of a Gaelic Catholic Ireland. And all of those currents, all of those elements were present in provisionalism. And provisionalism was a very unstable ideological formation. It meant, for example, that at particular points, members of it, both its leading members, not only, I think, for reasons of political mobilization, but also because of the strength of the left internationally, because of the prestige of the left, because of the series of other struggles that could be identified in these terms, did identify with Marxism, did identify with that type of rhetoric. Those of you who would be familiar with the type of internal debates, the type of material that the Provisionals were publishing in the 70s and in the 80s, know that those types of currents existed, know that that type of language existed. But there were also other currents as well. And what it means is that in any period of defeat, any period of downturn, any period of containment, that the ideological raw material for a particular set of politics, particularly the contemporary form of provisionalism, around forms of identity politics or nationalist politics, nationalist representative politics in the north of Ireland, are also present. So you have this quite wide range of material that can be drawn upon and used in this way. But it isn't only just as an abstract set of ideologies that you've got this sort of repertoire, this sort of menu that you can select from. It's also because within the provisional movement there were many people who were drawn into it with a number of very different motivations. Many people were drawn into the provisional movement in this very early period through the ideas of defence, defending their community from the attacks by the state, from loyalists, or for other motives of that kind. There were quite strong Hibernian and defenderist currents in particular areas. Those currents could, and in fact did, translate later on into a much more nationalistic emphasis. So again, not only do we have this ideological repertoire, but we also have bodies of opinion and elements in the provisionals which could take on the idea of defending the Catholic interest. And I think this idea of defending the community, of defending the Catholic population, indicates that within the provisional movement you have both ideological Republicans, those who are committed to reunification as a principle, and indeed the Socialist Republic in many cases, but also strategic Republicans who in a sense saw the reunification as a way of dealing with the particular problem of the nationalist population. In a way, they saw a way of breaking out of their isolation, breaking out of their discrimination and their lack of political power by joining the rest of the country, or in some instances literally rejoining the southern states in that way. So those types of Hibernian and nationalist currents also existed and were again quite easy to draw upon in this later period. Now, the means of mobilization of the Provisional Republican movement was initially around an armed struggle, around an armed campaign, but it was also, particularly in those areas most identified with the left, it was around the idea of political mobilization. And those ideas, I think, became crystallized in what we might call the idea of the resistance community. One of the ways of mobilizing the population was to mobilize the community, the working class populations, the rural communities, against the state. And in some readings, this, particularly in the late 70s, this drew from a whole number of writers, both on guerrilla warfare, but also on ideas of dual power, and indeed, although I think in a sense premature, even the idea of making certain areas of the larger cities ungovernable, and in a sense administering them as a form of state. Now that form of perspective was very much the Republican movement as the vanguard, as the leadership of the national revolution. And that national revolution would not only involve events in the north of Ireland, but also because of the nature of the southern state, which was analysed as a neo-colony, as in a sense a partner of British imperialism. It would involve a national revolution throughout the whole country. Indeed, this was quite explicitly stated in 1977 at the famous Bodenstown speech by Jimmy Drum, which reflected the line of a new, younger, more left provisional leadership, which argued that the war could not simply be fought around the issue of Ulster, around the occupied 6 counties, that it had in fact to be the all-Ireland revolution. Now this would probably have represented the pinnacle of left influence, I think, in terms of the provisional perspective. What I think was very important about it was that it saw the provisionals as the leaders of an Irish revolution, placed a tremendous emphasis on revolutionary subjectivity, the ability to mobilise the population, particularly drawing in the working classes, the working farmers, and other subordinate groups of that sort. So this represents a definite revolutionary perspective. It also represents, in many ways, an attempt to break out of what was increasingly the isolation of the provisionals. And this, again, helps us to understand their relationship with the British state. If we look at it as a series of armed actions, if we look at it as a war in that sense, the peak year for the provisionals is probably 1972. There is an argument that possibly 73, but 72 is probably their peak year. After that, they are increasingly contained militarily. And although they tie up large numbers of troops, of members of the RUC, the UDR, and loyalists as well, although they tie up large numbers of these forces, essentially they are on the defensive, and in many ways they become increasingly not only militarily contained, but also politically contained. Indeed, by the late 70s, the British state was aware that it couldn't actually militarily defeat the provisionals. In 1979, Major General Glover produced a report on the nature of the provisional movement and argued that they had the morale and the material and indeed the personnel to continue almost indefinitely, and also a degree of popular support in their base areas, but they would not be able to expand. So in a sense, the pattern of stalemate had been established. Now, again, as is well documented, and it's in many ways going over old history, one of the ways that they broke through that stalemate, I think in many ways quite accidentally, certainly I don't think they expected events to take that form, was the development of the electoral strategy following during the hunger strikes and the prison protests in 1980-1981. And that then, in a sense, opened up another front during the so-called ballot paper and Armalite phase. Now, that pitched the provisionals into forms of electoral politics, and one reading of it, certainly one reading of the leadership, the provisional leadership, is that this emerged quite accidentally, and that in a way they moved into the electoral battlefield because this front opened up. And I'm fairly certain that that's true. I'm fairly certain that they didn't sit down with a particularly conscious plan in that way. But at this point, their main focus was still on the cutting edge of the armed struggle, and indeed the movement into electoral politics was nowhere publicly regarded as a downplaying of the armed campaign. Indeed, even as late as 85 and 86, when the discussion on whether they should overturn the decision on abstention in the Southern Parliament was being discussed, the leadership was quite adamant that this would not mean a scaling down of the military campaign. Though I'm fairly convinced by this point that certain people in the leadership were considering that, but that's for others to discuss that at another point, I think. So the Armalite and the ballot paper strategy was still predominant and still kept the provisionals as the leading edge of the Irish Revolution, was still pitched in those terms. What began to enforce a change on that? How did that idea of revolutionary change begin to shift? Where did the ideological shift begin to emerge? And what was the important function of electoral politics in that? The shift, I think, occurred in a number of ways, which can in fact be now traced fairly clearly, certainly in terms of discussions that were going on in the journal Irish Fiog, which the Jack Conrad, Brian Keenan letters refer to. And there is already there's already a beginnings of a discussion about how the movement could develop. And what emerges is a debate around the issue of alliances, in particular the idea of an alliance of nationalist forces. Now this idea of alliances is often posed in revolutionary terms. It's often termed that the Provisionals will construct an alliance of progressive forces and that this will continue the fight for the Irish Revolution. But that very quickly elided from the idea of orientating towards particularly those elements in the south that were around Fianna Fáil, who would support Fianna Fáil. It quickly moved from an orientation towards that, towards a diplomatic form of orientation towards Fianna Fáil as a party. Likewise in the north, the argument that there were many SDLP voters who in a sense would support the Provisionals, and therefore you had to orientate towards them, was increasingly replaced with diplomatic orientation towards the SDLP itself. And indeed, in the late 1980s, talks opened up with the SDLP. Also at the same time, talks began with the Fianna Fáil government and the Fianna Fáil party leadership. This, I think, was one of the very first signs of a shift, in particular, a scaling down not only of the Provisionals' aims, but also a scaling down of their own expectations and their own assessment of what they can achieve. So that they've gone, for example, of the idea that their struggle would be the leadership of the Irish Revolution, to an idea that they now had to enter alliances. And it was a very short jump from that towards the type of nationalist alliance involving essentially the Dublin government, as opposed to the mass of the Irish people that that was made. But that shift, that ideological shift, was in many ways part of a much more fundamental shift which had occurred at what we might call the grassroots or the civil society level. And indeed that's the area that I consider to be increasingly significant in the 1980s and the 1990s. And it's here that I think the British state, in an area which has not generally been charted, primarily because it's not really the most glamorous of areas. Looking at figures about public expenditure on community projects is not always the most riveting activity. But I think it is, in a sense, it shapes the political terrain. And it's that I just want to really conclude on, because I think it's that I would regard as one of the significant features. The economic and social area had always been a factor of British state policy in the north. Even in the late 1960s, when the civil rights movement emerged, the Labour government argued that one of the ways to deal with insurgency, to deal with grievances, was to take the model of social deprivation, was to argue that essentially it was caused by unemployment, bad housing, and therefore addressing these questions would deal with the problem. So there had been this very long-running strand in British policy that dealt with these matters. This policy was given an added emphasis under direct rule, and was particularly given particular emphasis in the 1980s. One of the paradoxes was that as public expenditure was being cut in Britain, that in the north it was being maintained. And indeed, this idea of containment Keynesianism, the idea of using the state and of economic and social policies as a way of dealing with the fundamental causes of political violence, was very strongly entrenched. Now, this also had another important influence, and this simply was the strength of the state in the north of Ireland. The state in the north of Ireland still is the single largest employer, and in the 1980s, somewhere in the region of 45% of the population were indirectly employed by the state. Something like 70% of the GDP of the northern statelet was public expenditure in one form or the other, transfer payments as well as direct grants and subventions and so forth. So the state was an incredibly significant factor. Now, the policy of British governments, with varying degrees of emphasis, was what we might loosely call normalisation. Initially, the argument was not that the provisionals could be drawn in towards cooperation with the state. British policymakers believed that they were really beyond the pale and couldn't be brought in. But the argument was that, in a sense, normalisation would hold the line, would create a political space in which the moderates could come together to form a government. That, in a sense, had been the Sunningdale model in that, in the experiment that was tried in 73-74. But this was given an added twist in the 1980s and the 1990s, with a much closer engagement with the nationalist population. In particular, an emphasis on what increasingly became known in fashionable circles as the organisations of civil society. Remember that the Provisionals had attempted to construct their own support base inside the nationalist population, had attempted to build the resistance community within the nationalist population. And in many ways, what was increasingly happening in the 1980s was a battle for hegemony between the state and the Republican movement. On one side, you have the various community groups, activists, Sinn Fein advice centres, councillors, all of these elements. On the other side, you have not only the state's funding, but the Catholic Church, the SDLP, local business interests. And a considerable amount of time and effort on both a micro and a macro level is invested by the state in developing this particular area. Now, why this is significant is that increasingly Republicans, through their electoral strategy and indeed through their attempts to break out of their containment, find themselves being drawn closer into involvement with the state. Now, this is not a very crude, they've been bought off type of thesis. I'm not suggesting that the state has thrown money and the provisionals, the nationalist population, have bought it, as it were. That type of argument has been made. It's often made by Republican critics, and it's not the argument I'm putting here. What I am putting forward, though, is that as the Republican struggle becomes more and more contained, as it finds itself being drawn more and more into electoral politics, it finds itself, because it's functioning and working within those areas, having to make choices about how it operates. It's presented with dilemmas. Local councillors, local officials are presented with the dilemma. Do they take the money from the British state? Do they, in a sense, make Belfast work? Or do they, maintain what they increasingly saw as revolutionary purity and, shun the money? Now, not only was this occurring with the provisionals, but more importantly, it was occurring with their wider periphery and their wider support base. The state increased its penetration of those areas. And this, in a sense, shows both the strength and the weakness of the state. On one hand, the state has the resources. In the case of Northern Ireland, it has the armed bodies of men that we recognise as the state. But on the other hand, it is in order to obtain a degree of consent, it needs to internalise that consent. And that is increasingly what the normalisation agenda was about. It was about normalising, it was about internalising the idea that the state wasn't simply the soldiers on the corner, that the state was also a possible agency, that it was actually a potential neutral vehicle for achieving other aims. Again, this can be, I think, quite clearly charted. A very good example, I think, of this is the Fair Employment Act of 1989, and indeed the whole issue of equality and ending of discrimination against the nationalist population in employment. If you read the Provisional's submissions to the contributor to the Green and White paper, and you look at their comments on this, in the light of what has occurred since, but I would suggest probably some people looked at it much more closely at the time, you'll notice that the Act and the state are seen as potential instruments that can be used. For example, the enforcement of decisions about employment rights. The Provisionals argue that there should be a code of conduct which should be enforced by courts, that the state should draw up a code of conduct. Now, that is, a million miles away from their previous position, but it reflected very much, I think, the forms and the patterns of their politics. And it was just one example of this, and it's, I think, a fairly significant one. Now, it might be argued that I'm suggesting that the Provisionals were naive, and indeed, Sir Richard Needham, one of the Northern Ireland ministers who was developing this strategy, referred to the fact that the Provisionals had been caught like fish on a hook, and he seemed to think that they walked into this with their eyes wide open, that they didn't really know what was happening. Sorry, their eyes closed. Didn't really know what was happening. Well, in fact, the reverse is true. The Provisionals are very well aware of what was happening. They were aware, for example, of what British strategy was. As early as 1985, Mitchell McLaughlin talked about the way that the state was attempting to, inveigle its way into nationalist communities through these forms of agency. In an internal conference in 1991, in which there was a very good report which they produced, they outlined state strategy very well. So why did they become involved in it? Why did they, feel impelled to become involved in this way? Well, I think we come back to that issue of mobilization. We come back to that political perspective, which was that they felt constrained, they felt unable to take the movement forward. They felt that their influence was declining. Indeed, in 1989, Jim Gibney, one of the leading sort of backroom theoreticians of the Provisionals, said that they'd failed to develop a philosophy and ideology that was capable of mobilizing people, and that new fronts and new methods would have to be looked at. So in a sense, they adapted this strategy because for them it seemed to be the only one that was possible. But more importantly, wide layers of their own movement were becoming drawn into this. I interviewed a whole number of community activists and Republicans and asked them these questions about why they became involved and how they saw this development. And they were very well aware of the dangers, but argued that this would be a new battleground, that it was in a sense going into the enemy's camp, but it was a risk worth taking. So if that type of current, I think, is developing, then that, I think, gives us some of the idea of the ideological background to that. Combined, I think, with this sort of sense of containment inside the North itself, and increasingly the sense of the collapse of movements in other areas. In the internal debates that are taking place in 89 into 91, 92, constant references to events in South Africa, references to Nicaragua, references to the Palestinian issue, all, I think, reinforcing this point that the line that we're taking really is the only viable one. So if that element of state strategy explains, or helps to explain, it perhaps doesn't tell us entirely what has been created, and that's really what I want to just finish on. In the academic jargon, I'm sorry for introducing saying it to an audience of this character, I think that what has happened to the provisional movement is that they've become institutionalized. They've become, in a sense, the partner of the state. They've become an adjunct of the state. Mark and I, when we were having a conversation, part of which I think appears as the interview in the paper, said that it reminded him of what had happened to social democratic movements, particularly the German SPD, in the period before the First World War. And indeed, that was very much in my own mind. This idea that an insurgent movement not only builds up political support, but it actually builds up structures and institutions. And one of the paradoxes here is that the resistance community and the type of social networks that the Provisionals had developed, in a sense, have now been turned back and used against their original purposes. Just as the German SPD had built up, in a sense, a state within the state, a world within a world, the same thing, I think, was true of the Provisionals. But those structures, from having been for political mobilization in a different period and linked in with these developments and relationships with the state, very quickly became their reverse. So that, for example, from being means of mobilizing people, they became means of controlling and containing people. Even, I think, not only do we have the characteristics of a state, but also in some senses a real state. The Provisionals, for example, during the peace process, were, I think, effectively allowed to police their areas. They were allowed, in a sense, to deal with dissidents. They were given some of the functions of a police force working in partnership with the state. And it's that, I think, which is the significant point, that we can drop an ideological checklist. We can compare what Gerry Adams said in 1985 with what he's saying in 2005. That's actually fairly easy to do. You know, we've all said things in the past which we perhaps regret. And I'm sure Gerry Adams regrets some of the things that he said in the past. That would be quite easy. What I think would be perhaps more difficult to show is the nature now of provisional power. That we haven't just seen an ideological shift, we've actually seen, I think, the creation, through that relationship with the state, not just people in a sense revising the ideology, not just cooperating with the state, but I think in a very real way, a partnership with the state. And the description of the term institutionalization and that model of the various social democratic parties, and indeed other movements in other areas, for example, in Iraq, I'm sure that the British state does the same sort of thing, of alliances with former insurgent groups and allowing them to police areas and so forth. That, I think, does pose problems for the state, because it means that all the time that the Provisionals were being drawn into the state, were being drawn into the peace process, that was quite necessary. But it does leave a set of ragged edges which often reveal themselves in various court cases. They reveal themselves in semi-criminal activities. The difficulty for the state is that whereas in the past, a party like Fianna Fáil, which Sinn Fein is often compared to, that their guerrilla war lasted for a relatively short period of time. So the control of their armed wing was eventually relatively easy. But the provisional movement has been a functioning power for nearly 40 years. It's built up quite wide structures of power. It has it's got economic, it's got social, it's got the remnants of military power. And that will, I think, lead to some degrees of instability. It was fairly useful in terms of controlling dissidents during the peace process, but now I think we'll have to cease as the Provisionals, become, very well entrenched as part of the, the established order in the north of Ireland. So I really want to conclude there. As you can probably see from my notes, I've got quite a lot more that I could have argued, and perhaps quite a few more examples of the way that this process has occurred. But I wanted to reiterate the point about, one, the relationship between the state and the provisionals, which I think is the crucial point, but in particular to try to move away from an analysis of the provisionals which is either based upon its own internal dynamics, that, for example, just sees what happens to the provisional movement as very clever manoeuvring by Gerry Adams. Undoubtedly that was the case, but also tries to locate it in the economic and the social changes that have occurred in the north of Ireland, particularly, I think, the emergence of a Catholic middle class, the economic and social changes, the changing character of the economy in the north, I think, has been quite significant. And above all, the way that the provisional movement is no longer, it isn't either an insurgent movement, but it isn't also just a conventional political party, that it's also a structure of power in its own right, and that structure of power is now in partnership with the state, and indeed for much of the peace process that was the way that it was heading. That means then, I think, that in terms of discussion about lessons, we don't simply need to talk about the revolutionary programme, although that's significant. We also need to look at the nature of organisations, and in particular to look at the fact that an ideology like Irish Republicanism doesn't have a great, well-organised, coherent theoretical tradition, which makes revision quite easy, but also that in terms of its own internal regime, that it was a movement in which the party was ruled by the ethos of the army, that its own theoretical traditions of discussion are very limited, and indeed, as you know, I once asked a dissident member of the IRA, you know, how do you discuss these matters? He said usually by being, you know, forced out of the movement or worse. So those are areas, I think, which we need to consider, but we also need to consider the way that what was a very serious threat to the British state, you know, a serious armed and political threat to the state, was in fact incorporated into it. And that, in a sense, I think draws us back to, you know, the nature of revolutionary leaderships and the nature of revolutionary politics. And indeed a whole series of revolutionary and socialist movements which have had their edge blunted by the state in this way. I'll answer them briefly, but perhaps take them up at the end. First of all, just on the issue of the Adams leadership, a point that was made by...
You're getting jury time.
Yeah. A point that was made by Phil Ferguson in an article in the Weekly Worker, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, was he made the point that Gerry Adams and the other provisional leaders had a certain prestige, and he in particular compared Gerry Adams and Tony Blair, and he was trying to make the point that Gerry Adams carried a military prestige, and more importantly Martin McGuinness, and also, you know, Brian Keenan as well. If they said something, it wasn't that they were, you know, just intellectuals and dilettantes. These are people who've done time, you know. So I think this is very important in terms of explaining the internal dynamics. One of the points about the provisionals is often not so much what you say, but what you've done can be quite important, I think. And you know, it isn't sort of just simply a cult of the personality, you know. And I think that explains quite a lot. You know, certainly from my reading of it. I entirely agree with your point about you know, looking around for funding and so forth, but I think that comes back to the issue of nation as opposed to class. And I'm particularly struck by Brendan Hughes, who I interviewed you know, for the book and so on, talking about some visits that he'd made in terms of arms deals with America, and he said that he was dealing with people there who he was talking about the Black Panthers and so on, and these were people who were a million miles away, in fact were fairly racist. And he expressed a number of reservations about their contacts, although there were some very good Irish Americans and on the left as well, and it would be wrong, as I'm sure you're aware, just to see them all as Hibernians in that way. On the issue of Marxist ideas and Cahill Goulding and so on, I think, to simplify what is in fact quite a complex issue, I think the decisive issue wasn't necessarily Marxism, because there were many people who became involved with the Provisionals who, on a sort of a left-right basis would have probably been ideologically closer to the sticks, to the officials. Gerry Adams, for example, many people were very surprised that he became involved because he was always considered to be on the left. I think the key thing, particularly in the north, was really about defence and about the people who were going to do something. And Goulding, in particular, was often seen as a fairly utopian thinker, sitting down in Dublin issuing press releases rather than something happening, getting guns up to defend us. And then with the appearance of troops on the street and the idea that it was now a war for national liberation, Goulding's form of Marxism, his stagism and so on, seemed to really just not meet the case. So I would see it more like that than than an aversion to Marxism. Although, of course, in February 1970 or January-February 1970, the founding statements of the Provisionals do talk about an alien ideology, and they are quite explicitly anti-communist. Although paradoxically, Rory O'Brody, who I've interviewed, I actually find, although he has his own particular form of politics, would strike me as more genuinely left-wing, and indeed actually quite secular, although he's often characterised as a Catholic nationalist in this way. So I think it was more the events of '69 that were the decisive factor there. On the tantalising Livingston question, funnily enough, I'm just looking at a copy of the Leninist here, and it actually talks about the Labour Committee in Ireland and implicit pro-imperialists like Livingston, Short and Hayne.
You think that's an accident?
I picked up on that on two counts. One was the work of people like Martin Collins, and it just struck me simply that there were long established links which actually predate the 90s. I mean, I think the earliest references I find in the FOB book are about 83, and one of the things that struck me was there was this long established link, and in a way it was a ready-made model. And one of the things that strikes me about the left in the Provisionals is that they were often quite willing to take sort of ready-made models from somewhere else. And this was a model of a radical local authority. There is an article, I think, when Livingston visits West Belfast, and they talk about what he's doing on the GLC, and it's just about the time that they're starting to get people elected. The other thing as well, which is actually mentioned in the book, and I got it from, he's actually my PhD student, Kevin McNamara, who was, the Northern Ireland spokesman for the Labour Party, referred to the fact that, I don't want to bore you with internal dealings of the Labour Party, but Adams contacted the Labour Committee on Ireland to get them to tone down a resolution. I think it is mentioned in the book now, but he got them to tone down a resolution deleting withdrawal of troops from Northern Ireland and just pushing the McBride principles. And it seemed to me that orientation towards the Labour left, and indeed the Labour Party, was quite strong. I mean, I remember in some of my dealings that Sinn Fein people were very keen to address meetings in Britain, and one of the things that I noticed into the 1990s, originally they would have been quite happy to come and speak to a meeting like this, but by the middle 1990s they were asking people like me in Britain to get them in to see more influential politicians and indeed business people and other opinion formers. So it is, as you say, tantalising. I think it's more a case of a ready-made model. And also, one of the things that struck me in my interviews was that many Irish Republicans have quite an intimate knowledge of what happens in Britain. They do follow events in Britain, even down to the level of, in a sense, sharing part of a common political culture. It wouldn't have been, I think, that alien for them to look at what was happening in London, in that way. But it's actually something I'm considering writing about, is a sort of history of the left in its broadest sense in Ireland, and I think that will be quite important. Shame Boris Johnson didn't pick up on it in the election, isn't it? Yeah. And then just one thing, I'd like to defend East Tyrone. It did produce Tommy McKinney. Not everybody in East Tyrone is, as you describe, and I'll be visiting there in a couple of weeks, so I have to say that. Yeah. Just on the containment Keynesian issue, and in particular the issue of Harlan de Wolf and so on, The statistics are well. Perhaps we'll deal with it, in discussion. But I think certainly there was a very clear attempt to involve the nationalist population, and that levels of spending, and in particular recruitment of Catholics into the public services, was quite clear. I mean, if we look at the figures and we now look at the breakdowns, we can see that was occurring. And but in the other areas, in terms of the Catholic middle class, like law and the various professions, I think in a sense that was independent. Although but I think it is actually more nuanced. I think maybe the points that that the left were making about Orange ascendancy weren't always entirely accurate there. Just one last point, and I'll leave those others for the summary. I actually specifically asked Danny Morrison and Tom Hartley about the impact of the fall of the Soviet Union, and they both said no, that they were Irish Republicans, these things didn't really matter, and so on. But I think that they do. I think if you look at their papers, and if you look at the sort of tenor, even if you just look at the geopolitics, that there's no longer a power in a sense that offsets that of America and offsets that of Britain. And indeed, the whole idea of transforming society, which was embodied in the Soviet Union, that I think is very much on the is put very much on the back burner. What I think is perhaps more important, although it is linked to the issue of Stalinism, is South Africa. In that the model of South Africa now for a transition became very important. Quite directly, large numbers of members of the South African Communist Party and the ANC became involved in the peace process, visited Northern Ireland, went into the jails, and I think that type of model, saying, well, the revolutionary model is no longer possible, but the type of transitional model that we have is there. But I think it was a factor, but the Provisionals would deny that the fall of the Soviet Union was, partly because they always tried to eschew, or certainly in the recent times, they've tried to eschew anything, any connection with the Soviet Union and that type of leftism. Run the thread through it if I can, although they were quite wide-ranging. I think Anne made a very interesting comment, or a series of interesting comments, which in a way led on to other questions about the nature of the two states in Northern Ireland, the two states in Ireland. And in many ways, I sort of asked that to be a question, and I don't give a particular sort of pat answer, as it were. But one thing is certainly very clear, and that is that Northern Ireland as an entity, and I deliberately use the phrase Northern Ireland there, is a place apart. It has a distinct set of social structures. The welfare state, which has been in existence since the late 40s, means that any form of working class politics has certain different forms. And I would go so far as to suggest that the 60 years or so of that separate development has had a considerable political impact. And certainly in terms of it's had an impact on the political development of Sinn Fein, for the way that various speakers have indicated that Gerry Adams, when he took part in that debate, and I've seen the tape of it, was quite clearly out of his depth. Indeed, I would suggest that probably many people in Britain had a better knowledge of Irish politics and the nuts and bolts of the health service than he did in terms of the South. So I think that is an important point in terms of stabilisation, and indeed in terms of the way that Sinn Fein may well develop. One of the speakers at the front here asked whether Sinn Fein's managerialism is that the future of politics? And indeed, that's one of the other questions that's sort of been hanging in the air about the future of Sinn Fein. In many ways, Sinn Fein has become sort of more New Labour than New Labour. And one of the things that strikes me in any dealings I have with them, and I think Kurt made this point very well, is that there is a generational shift, that you increasingly find very young people. Now, I know that's a problem of middle age, that you think everybody is young. But when the Sinn Fein activists start to get young, I mean, it's bad enough with policemen and football managers, but Sinn Fein activists, that actually is quite a serious point, because you're dealing now with people who have not had have not sort of been through the traditions. When you think about it now, someone in their 20s would have had is barely born, for many of the events, and you've now got to be pushing 30, 40. I mean, I was surprised, for example, to interview a 40-year-old woman who was a teenager in the hunger strike, which I think of as a very recent event. So I think that generational shift is important, and I think that this managerialism that you refer to is, in a sense, the way Sinn Fein have bought into that. They are very much part of that agenda, and I think Kurt put it very well in that you've got two Sinn Feins, you've got two Belfasts, you've got the Belfast that's being promoted in the tourism, the weekend break Belfast, and then you've got the depoliticised Belfast, and it's in that Belfast that Sinn Fein have a problem. And they have a problem which I think is quite comparable to New Labour. What happened to Dahay Mackay up in Ballymena is not far removed from what would happen to a Labour councillor who goes around to a sink estate and tells people to start behaving themselves. It is exactly the same point. Now, it means that Sinn Fein, in a sense, have completely raised themselves up above. I mean, physically, many of the new Sinn Fein councillors don't live in the areas, and you're increasingly seeing fairly low turnouts. You're seeing, in fact, I think the New Labour phenomenon. It's one way where I would, make that analogy. And it's very striking that a lot of the old militants are fading off the scene. Many of them, are not sufficiently house trained. They're not particularly telegenic. They don't really come out with the buzzwords and so on. And that this new generation of Sinn Fein leader, fits the bill. Just as a small point on that, this was really brought home to me when I was doing research for the book, and I was looking at the Irish Times for 1981 about the hunger strike. And in those days, the Irish Times sport was actually the first item that you came to, and then you came to the news. But on one side of the paper is a report of the hunger strike and the various developments, and on the other side there's a picture of the Irish international tennis team. And a member of that Irish international tennis team is one Katrina Ruan, right? So you can make all sorts of things about firing volleys for Ireland and so on, and
You wouldn't, would you?
No, right. But I thought it was quite poignant, that while other people were involved in the struggle, she was, doing something else in that way. So I think that will become a significant point, and I think that that depoliticisation, which is all the more dramatic because West Belfast was regarded as the most politicised people on earth, in the famous phrase. I think that's all the more apparent. The social problems, in particular, I think the way that Sinn Fein will use the same sort of politics of fear, the same sort of rhetoric about young people, about drug dealers, about urban panics, and again, it's all the more dramatic because the same sort of language was previously used against the Republican movement as well. So I certainly think that will be one of the strands that will become very strong in the north of Ireland. In terms of the south, which again came into the discussion, and I was quite pleased about it because I didn't write much about it, and I think it is quite significant. I think that the characterisation of the South and the way that the Provisionals have characterised the South and the way that we should characterise the South is quite important. And I think the point about the EC, and indeed what you might call the consolidation of the southern states, and in particular the development in political terms, a very strong southern state identity, almost a 26-county nationalism, I think is very important. I think in many ways, many politicians played on that throughout the period of the conflict, and it was very much a case of, keep that up there, we don't want the trouble down here, and I think that has, been increasingly strengthened. I certainly agree with the speaker at the back who talked about the mass mobilisations. 1972 and 1981 were periods of great mobilisation, but in many ways they were, I think, something of the last kick of that type of republicanism, which still identified with the struggle in the north. Just on a personal point, as a teenager and young person, I spent a large part of my summers every summer with my grandparents in and around Dublin from about, from the 50s, 60s into the early 70s. And certainly my observations at that time, as the civil rights movement was unfolding and those movements were unfolding, was of a great deal of interest. People going off on demonstrations and, becoming involved in that way. Whether Sinn Féin's development in the South, I think, will be interesting. And Anne McShane wrote an article recently about the impact of the referendum and the role of Sinn Féin in the referendum. And I think Sinn Féin does have some potential for playing a left card. And I think if the economic crisis develops in the South, and I think there will be some people looking for some form of alternative, and it's possible that Sinn Féin may well take that. The other possibility is that they may also take a type of left populism, left nationalism. Certainly their opposition to the European Union towards the Lisbon Treaty seem to figure in that. I certainly think it will be a very confused form of politics, but I think we could posit really two Sinn Féins emerging, and I think increasingly a sort of southern-based Sinn Féin and then a northern-based Sinn Féin, which in many ways pull in slightly different directions in that way. I thought the discussion on the German SPD was interesting. It's a long time since I've revisited Michel's and oligarchy theory and so on. But I think one speaker made a very important point, and it's actually the issue of state form. And I think it's this, and unfortunately I didn't really deal with it in my opening remarks. And I think it is significant that the German SPD, in a sense, were German patriots who saw the state as something that they could be elected to, they could take hold ready-made, and I'm sure you're all aware of the discussions around that. But the significant similarity was that although Sinn Féin never said this clearly, their politics in the 1980s onwards also, I think, carried that implication. As I mentioned, in terms of the Fair Employment Act and in terms of the whole equality agenda, there was this argument that the British state was, in a sense, a lever. And indeed, in a wider sense, in, for example, the document Towards a Lasting Peace in Ireland in 1992, Sinn Féin does talk about the possibilities of Britain being a persuader for unity. And I think this idea of Britain having some sort of positive role, or the state having some sort of positive role, is there. And I think that's where the similarity is clear. But my similarity was more of an analogy between the type of world that the German SPD had developed in terms of its newspapers, in terms of its cultural organisations, and it was more the case that a similar type of world existed in the nationalist community in Northern Ireland, but that community, that world could then be turned against itself, that far from it being mobilising, it could in a sense be a type of crust, a type of barrier to further political action in that way. Why I like meetings like this is that it's very rare that I get anybody making discussion points on the SPD and the cat putsch, so I could do with more of that, please. I think people may well have gathered that Sinn Féin's agenda is very much that of neoliberalism, private finance initiative, even the arguments about corporation tax and incentives. I normally, on these occasions, have a series of quotes from Gerry Adams talking to businessmen and chambers of commerce, but you'll just have to take my word for it that he's, very strongly in favour of that type of, neoliberal agenda. Although, of course, it can tack somewhat to the left and then talk about, the need to have some sort of regulation. But it's really no further left than large parts of the Labour Party in that way. Speaker at the front here made, I think, a very important point, one I've always stressed, and that is that when the provisional movement was developing, it was developing in terms of industrial militancy in Britain and a whole series of crises elsewhere. And one of the things I tell my students when I teach this period is to just ask them to look at a newspaper, and the Times is always good for this because they always used to have these really scaremongering editorials that I recall, about is Britain ungovernable, and the possibilities of a military coup and so forth. I know certain sections of the left, the Socialist Labour League or the Workers' Revolutionary Party, God, that dates me, doesn't it, used to talk about, the possibilities of a military coup. But certainly that idea that we were in some sort of, serious crisis was very prominent, which means that when we look at the IRA's campaign, and indeed we look at Irish republicanism, it wasn't a sideshow. And I think that when the cabinet documents are released, even though they will be edited, I think it will reveal that the material that has been released already certainly puts these things into that sort of context in that way. I think there are. I think there are a couple of questions which I raised at the beginning, which were touched on, and in a way, sort of keep on coming back to haunt us, and that's really about the relationship of the national and the socialist revolution. And I seem to think that there's still probably a lack of clarity, or people are not clear really whether the national revolution and indeed the Republican demand still has any viability. I seem to think, for example, that the issue of the South in particular is one that we need to address, and whether, for example, this form of 26 county nationalism and the stabilisation of the southern entity, whether that will mean that for a considerable period that type of demand will be off the agenda. Certainly, if Kirk's points are accurate, and I think he is generally accurate about depoliticisation, what we may well see in the North are various protest movements, but an inability, in a sense, to generalise them. What the Provisionals were able to do, and they did this with fairly slender and, in theoretical terms, quite meagre resources, was to build a movement based upon the national revolution, because not only was there a revolutionary situation, not only was there a crisis, but the Irish Republic did seem to be the viable alternative. It seemed to be the solution to the problems faced by the nationalist population in the north. Those lads that had the run-in with Dahi Mackay may well have been connected to various dissident Republican groups, and they may well believe that the 32-county republic is the solution. But whether large sections of the depoliticised hoods and spides of Belfast, drinking their cider and doing all the other socially deviant activities and putting two fingers up to the Ra and so on, whether they see the national revolution, much less the socialist revolution, as an alternative, I think is open to doubt. So I think what is different about movements now is not that the discontent doesn't exist, not that there isn't a need for a movement, that there isn't the objective need there. It's just that I think subjectively the Republic as a solution, I think, seems further off. It seems no longer the immediate solution. And unfortunately, it isn't that people have seen through nationalism, have now progressed to socialism. I fear that they're actually at a lower level than that. That isn't meant to be. It isn't meant to be pessimistic. It isn't, meant to be miserabilist or anything else. But certainly, in many ways, the contrast between the type of politics that we saw in the 70s and the early 80s with what now exists, I think, is even greater in the north than it is perhaps here. And if you want to think of an analogy, go to a mining community which is now riddled with unemployment and drugs, and compare that with the same sort of political consciousness in the north of Ireland. In many ways, I think there are some similarities, and that's part of a much wider issue about the nature of any form of revolutionary project. So that's probably not a very uplifting way to end, and I should really be talking about the possibilities of all sorts of things occurring. And indeed, objectively, those do exist. But certainly, what the Provisionals have done, in many ways, is to have created structures which actually have closed down that mobilisation, and then a whole series of other economic and social developments have added to it. Just sort of one last point about Marxists subordinating themselves to the interests of other social groups. I think there was, to a certain extent, that was very important in the Provisionals. And I think this is again the problem of nationalist movements. I think it was also, though, very much linked into the particular theoretical tradition of Irish republicanism, and indeed how Irish republicanism organised. And I rather jokingly talked about the fact that the idea of a loyal opposition is an oxymoron in Irish republicanism. But I well remember, admittedly, a conversation fueled by a certain amount of whiskey at Christmas time, discussed how, with a number of people who later left the Provisionals, how you could, change the agenda. So I rather naively said, well, what you need to do is get a document together and circulate it around, the various branches or Cumann and so on. And they just said, well, this isn't possible. That would be an offence. That would be mutiny, and you would be court-martialed for it. And that is, that is exactly the point. The only way, certainly in terms of the IRA, that you could really function was in a sense to have a majority. Or alternatively to have more guns at the important meeting, someone suggested, well, what we need to do is to arrest Adams and McGuinness. In other words, we need to have more guns than they do. So the people that I was discussing with were fairly articulate Marxists. I mean, they had written long documents and so forth, but how you operated inside that movement was very different. So if any of us think that the sectarian politics of the British left were a problem, at least when the split came, you didn't have the shootout with it. Well, at least not in my experience anyway. Right.
Okay.